directors of Skowhegan, along with my co-director Sarah Wickna and our colleague Katie Grogan. I'm very happy to welcome you tonight to this conversation between Bill and Courtney. A huge thank you to Hallie and Michael and your team here for this presentation. This is a special night for Skowhegan because Bill is a very special part of Skowhegan. He was a student in 1965 and returned as faculty numerous times over the course of the 70s. He was a governor from 1972 to 1990 and was even the acting director in the summer of 1979. We're thrilled to celebrate this breathtaking exhibition with him tonight. A committed abstractionist for over 4 decades, Bill's work has been exhibited worldwide and represented in over 30 public collections. He's the recipient of numerous awards of distinction, including the Individual Artist Award in Painting from the National Endowment for the Arts, a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, a Joan Mitchell Foundation grant, and most recently, the Skowhegan Governor's Award for Outstanding Service to Artists in recognition of his catalytic impact in founding the Artist in Residence program at the Studio Museum in Harlem. He is joined by Courtney Martin, who is assistant professor in the Department of Art and Architecture at Brown University, and the newly appointed deputy director and chief curator at Dia Art Foundation. I'm particularly excited about that because for those of you who know me, before I was at Skowhegan, I worked at Dia for 8 years, and I couldn't be happier to see another amazing female curator in that role, so congratulations. She has written about Bob Ryman, Frank Bowling, Laura Favaretto, and has a forthcoming, I think, interview in the catalog with Bill that will accompany this show. So with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much, Katie. So I feel like Katie started us off in the perfect way. She gave us all our dates, so we're ready. We know that you spent the summer of 1965 at Skowhegan, but how did you get there? What led to that summer?
I was a student at Pratt my junior year. Richard Beauvais, Alex Katz, Jimmy Ernest suggested that I go to Skowhegan. I had no idea what Skowhegan was, where it was. I had faith in them and their interest in me as an artist. So I went up, spent the summer there.
So Ernst Katz, they were your teachers at Pratt?
They were.
And Beauvais?
Richard Beauvais was the person that I had at that moment. Most of the teachers that I had were figurative, very few abstractionists. The person that was most influential was Richard Beauvais.
You told me this great story that where you're talking about that moment, and he says to you, you've gone to see a Hans Hofmann show and you've never really heard of Hofmann before. Mm-hmm. And you went and you were really inspired by the work. You came back, and then he says, well, now you're going to Skowhegan.
It's pretty much it.
Okay.
It was pretty much it. I came back, started painting, and by the end of the semester, I had made a transition away from the figuration and away from the kind of... He would always create very large environments, and you could paint them abstractly, you could paint them representational. I just never looked up at the thing that was there at all. I was just really involved in the material and the surface that was in front of me. And by the end of the semester, he suggested this place, Skowhegan, and that it was a summer program. And I went.
Were you the only Pratt student that you didn't go that summer? Did you go alone, basically, or were you with other people?
There was actually one other Pratt student, that Marjorie Portnow, a figurative painter. She paints landscapes. She was the second Pratt student that was there.
So what happened? I mean, I think I don't have a good sense of what Maine would have looked like in 1965. I can imagine New York in 1965, and I can imagine what I think the painting conversation is in New York in 65, but, you know, did it feel the same? I think I asked you this once before, and I used, you know, one of the words I made up. I said, you know, did Maine that summer feel New Yorky, or was it someplace else? Was Skowhegan separate from the New York painting world at that moment?
Skowhegan was very, very separate. I had never been to Maine. I arrived in Maine, and the thing that struck me, Maine was very much like North Carolina. It was kind of a rural place. The people were very independent. There was a long tradition of artists being in Maine and painting there, and certainly a long tradition in terms of Skowhegan. It was, how do I say it? Being so removed from the architecture and this kind of brick environment of New York, that was the first shock. The second shock is everything was green. And as a painter, and as an abstract painter particularly, you're struggling against all of that green, all of that landscape. You're also struggling against, when I was there, 90% of the students were representational and painting landscapes or figurative paintings. I should say probably 98%, to be more accurate. The faculty was interesting because it was the person that had the biggest impact upon me that summer was Alfred Leslie, who was also figurative. He had shifted from abstraction into painting these very large portrait paintings. And then you had other artists like Jack Levine, which was really, really in another world in relation to me.
What does that mean, in another world? Do you mean that because he was interested in representational work?
He was not only interested in representational work, but it was like somewhere in the 30s.
Okay.
And that was the most severe criticism that I received that summer was from Jack Levine.
Did it feel, I imagine that conversation, knowing about what the conversation in the city might have been like, did it feel like a knee-jerk reaction? Did it feel out of date? Or did it feel like he was trying to push you to actually say something with abstraction? I mean, was it considered?
No, he was just telling me abstraction was not art.
Oh, okay.
That was basically the conversation. It wasn't subtle at all. It was like, but the saving grace is that there were a number of people that came up, the visiting artists. Louise Nevison came up that summer, and she was terrific. Frank O'Hara came up that summer as a visiting critic. Henry Gelsalt came up that summer as well. And what's her name? Oh goodness, I'm blocking the lady's name. Venezuelan.
Oh, Marisol.
Marisol came up.
Okay.
She came up that summer. So there was this other input during the summer that was, for me, was really terrific. Nevison was really terrific. She took her interest in the work, and that was really extremely helpful. And the person that was most helpful was Bill Cummings, who was one of the founders of the school and lived on campus. He took a terrific interest in the body of work that I was doing and would always suggest parallels to the work. So he was very much involved in what was going on in the art world, but he was also very often suggesting I look at earlier people and see maybe a connection between those things.
Who did he suggest?
Stuart Davids.
Okay.
What's his name? Lazitsky. Malevich.
So he's gearing you both to the Americans, but then also back to the Europeans, which would have, I mean, that's interesting for that time, because there is also a split between whether or not the Americans are inventing something for themselves and have done so since 45, or whether or not it's just a European importation. So it's interesting to see that he was still thinking broadly.
I think he was thinking in my best interest in terms of trying to get me to see the bigger and broader picture in terms of what art could be and what art had been. But
So so between 90 and 98% in your straw poll entered as figurative painters. Did 90 to 98% exit that summer? Did anyone convert to the abstract
Absolutely
side?
not.
None.
Absolutely not.
I thought you were going to say there's a huge revolution.
No, there was no revolution. A lot of the students were coming from schools, either BU or Indiana. They were coming from colleges that had strong figurative programs, and they were absolutely committed to that body of work. My two roommates were figurative painters. Don Perlis is one, and the other was another figurative painter named Lester Goldman. And they have continued to make representational work over the 50-year period.
Did you talk about it with them? Like, was there a conversation? Did the abstract people, the 2% of you, did you move to the side and talk to yourselves and talk to Leslie, or did you, were you integrated in and you talked to each other and tried to battle out the conversation?
There were active battles and active discussions about representational versus abstraction, but it basically just went to your studio and did what you want. I mean, that was my way of spending the summer there.
So this is a really productive summer for Bill. So first he learns about Skowhegan, then he goes to Skowhegan. By the middle of the summer, you've actually completed a body of work. By the end of this summer, two good things have happened to you. The first is that the University of Maine acquires one of his paintings while still a student, not only at Skowhegan, but also a student still at Pratt. He's not graduated yet. And then you meet Lenny Beaucourt.
I do.
Who is Lenny Beaucourt, for those of us who don't know?
Lenny Beaucourt was a paint manufacturer. He was one of the developers of acrylic paint, and for a long time was probably the most dominant brand. Golden Paint is the grandchild of that. Golden and Beaucourt were partners in Beaucourt Paint. The importance of that was Lenny became a patron and provided me with paint for a good 15 years after I left Skowhegan, as well as technical information. If I would have a technical problem, I would call Lenny up and he would say, come on up to the factory, and he would allow me to show him what the problem was. And then he or the chemist and other people would try to help me find a resolution for it. So a lot of what I wanted to do was possible because of their expertise and their help. But he was absolutely essential in my development in terms of being a patron and supporting me over a very, very long period of time.
And it starts with that summer. You receive the Beaucourt Painting Prize, right? And then you go back and you continue talking to him. And you say he was a patron, but it seems like it's a bit more than that. It seems as if you have some sort of collaboration, because I've heard from other painters that some of the things that you innovated with him became the kinds of paints that they would also then use. So you're kind of an advisor in some sense.
Well, I wouldn't use that word. These shimmering paintings, I was up there one day and he said, well, I have this material that why don't you take it home and play with it? So it was a powder, basically. I took it home and kind of played with it for 6 or 7 months, and he came down and he looked and he asked some questions. And they have a line of paint now that's metallic or shimmering. It would have saved me a lot of lungs if he had it at that point. Because one of the things that occurred is that it was a powder, and it gets up into the studio, and then it gets in your lungs, and then you cough. And well, that happened to me during the mid-'70s. The reason I stopped making these paintings was because I was getting respiratory problems because of the material. So in one sense, it was really wonderful for him to support me during that period. On the other side, it's nice to develop something, but there's a safer version of it now.
How long did it take him to get to the safer version? How many years between your first play with it until the new
I
version
played
came
with
out?
it in the late 60s through 74.
Wow.
They came out with this line of paint, or Golden came out with a line of paint about 6 years ago.
So tell me if this is true. I think this might be true. The interaction with Beaucourt also leads you to begin working with acrylics for the first time.
It does. It
Okay.
does.
Were acrylics just outer space to you? Because I mean, they represent a new form of painting in some way, a new way of making painting, definitely. What happened when you went back to Pratt with this new information?
When I went back, the paint, I had won this paint prize. He said, come up to the factory. I went up to the factory, and what Beaucourt gave me was oil paint.
Okay.
So I went back to Pratt. I was playing with the oil paint. I was getting rashes constantly from the turpentine and the other kind of agents. And I decided one day, I asked him about this other stuff, acrylic paint. He said, well, take some. And I made the shift to acrylic paint because, one, it was quicker, it was cleaner, and the colors were, I was able to use the color in a way that it didn't get muddy easier. So the shift to the acrylic painting comes in the senior year of Pratt.
And was that a conversation that you had with people? Were other people starting to use acrylics at that moment? Was it as much of a conversation as the abstract figuration conversation? The oil acrylic, was that?
No conversation, just
Okay.
I did it, and it was it. It was
And
like
you talked to no one?
I talked to no one. Right?
Okay.
It was just a more accessible material for me.
Okay.
I was living in a little apartment on Claremont Avenue in Brooklyn, and it wasn't even an apartment. It was one room, so the oil fumes were incredibly toxic. And when I shifted to the acrylic paint, it made my life a lot easier.
You're scaring someone here right now who owns a brownstone in Claremont. Someone right now is thinking to themselves, I bet I bought that.
That's right. Well, good luck with it. I don't know what else to say. But
So 65, the summer, you're back in the fall to Pratt. You graduate in 66. By the fall of 66, you had gone to New Haven to attend Yale as an MFA student. You stay in touch with Beaucourt, I assume, during that time?
I do.
And then by 70, 2 years after you graduate Yale, you have returned now to be a visiting teacher for the summer at Skowhegan. How did that occur? Did you stay in touch? Did people stay in touch with the students after they leave, or did you know that you could be invited back in that way?
I never dreamed that they would invite me back.
Why?
A lot about myth. Older artists, the artists that I met there had enormous reputations, had from Nevison to Ben Shawn they had worked many, many, many years, 25, 30 years. And I was basically out of graduate school 2 years. So that was really a surprise.
And so how long were you there? Did you stay the whole summer then?
The first summer I shared the summer, I was there half of the summer. Bryce Martin was there the first half, I was there the second half.
Did you overlap at all?
We overlapped about 5 or 6 days.
Okay. And what did you do? What does the teacher do that summer? What does the visiting teacher do?
Oh, gee.
I mean, many of us are not artists.
Well,
We're
okay.
not really sure what happens at Skowhegan.
The structure when I was there is basically you went to the studios 2 days a week, and you just walk in the studios and enter in a dialogue with the student if they wanted to enter in a dialogue. If they didn't, you went to the next studio. And that was pretty much the way it was set up when I was there. There was one-on-one during the week, and then on Saturdays there would be a huge crit. And Saturdays was the critical moment in terms of the faculty talking about the work, whether there was development, what you should try, what you should think about, trying to get you to refine your ideas. And that was pretty much the structure. There were no classes per se. There never have been classes. It's all one-on-one.
How did it differ coming back in this teaching role as opposed to the student role? Well, first of all, between 65 and 70, what was the abstract to representational split by then?
By that time, the art world had really shifted to abstraction. And it had not only shifted to abstraction, but it was the kind of minimalist movement was really becoming pretty dominant. The older artists that were either abstract expressionists or second-generation expressions were not as popular. The first summer that I taught there probably was really the beginning of the first exposure probably of Bryce Martin, of Chuck Close. That whole generation of artists were just getting a foothold in the art world.
So you and Bryce, because you're rough contemporaries.
We are.
Do you think that you were invited precisely for that conversation? Because you could have talked about older art in the same way that you could also talk about what was really happening downtown at that moment.
I think they invite artists in terms of a number of ways, stylistically, but also in terms of age. And part of the thing when you're the youngest artist is obviously you come with energy, you come with maybe fresh ideas, and you come with the hope of some kind of merger can occur between the older faculty members, the younger faculty members, and whomever else is left. It was a good summer for me the first time I taught there. You know, it was like a graduation for me, going from thinking about myself very, very differently at that point.
Is one of those things when you say thinking about yourself differently, 1969, Bill begins to use his paintings to match the scale, or to cut his paintings basically into the scale of his own body. By 1970, when you arrived there, I assume that's all you're doing, that that's the only way that you constructed composition at that point. Is that true?
By 1970, and once you said my body, I decided that this would be the widest painting that I would make, whatever I could reach this way, and when I'm standing, whatever I could reach that way. And what that allowed me to do is have a instant relationship to my own body and to scale. It also allowed me to have a signature way of entering the painting each time. There's inherent content primarily because of that. And those were kind of decisions that I made. This painting was made in Skowhegan in 1972, I think. The second time that I went back to Skowhegan, this painting was painted at Skowhegan.
And what's the title of it?
This is called Texas Lady. Texas Lady refers to a lady that was there named Nancy Negley. She came up, she was a very good friend of Bill Cummings, and she came up for the summer. And the reason I named the painting for her is that she gave me a birthday party, which I thought was extraordinary. This lady that I didn't know, and gave me a birthday party. And gave me a lobster, first time I had ever eaten lobster. So I had a kind of fondness for this experience, and thus Texas Lady.
Does this painting in any way relate, other than the experience of interacting with this person and having this fond memory, but are the colors in any way related to the atmosphere in Maine? Like, do you look at, are you influenced in any way by its landscape, by its geologic features?
I was trying not to be.
Okay.
The only thing that was influencing me was the lake, because the house that I stayed on, it actually jutted out into the water of the lake. That was the most dominant experience, was that lake over and over again, and the repetition of the water hitting the shore and under the house, and the kind of shimmering that occurred in the late afternoon. I tried everything possible not to look at the landscape, not to look at all of that green. That was really difficult. I mean, because it's just green, or it's gray. And those two experiences of, it's very cold in the morning. If you haven't been to Maine, Maine is very cold in the morning, then it gets warm, it gets cool in the evening, and that cycle just repeats itself. And when you're there early, it also rains a great deal. So you have this environment that's changing constantly, and you really have to interact with it. And I tried everything I could to stay focused, to stay compartmentalized in terms of trying to make abstract paintings up there.
For those of you who've not seen this painting up close, I invite you to do so after we conclude. But I promise you that this is true about this painting, that it has a kind of repeating weft pattern that then you change the direction with in different sections. Is there a kind of word or title that you use for that pattern? Because I've seen it before in other works.
Well, the title of the series is called the Shimmering Series. And the reason there are two reasons I went to that, or it evolved into that. Some of the earlier paintings, the large prismatic paintings have, if you look close, there are surfaces that are beginning to undulate. The metallic is beginning to enter the painting, wanting a surface that's both independent but also active. When I got to these paintings were painted as a reaction to the larger paintings. They were painted as a reaction to teaching with a lot of figurative painters and tonal painters. And I wanted to make a series of paintings that were so close in tone and so close in value that the idea of the color in the other paintings were not controlled would never come up as an issue. And thus this series of paintings. There are 18 in the series. And these two paintings are actually the same color. They're both dioxide purple, which is the only color that's used. But they look drastically different, primarily because of the use of both the control, but also the use of how much material is placed in it, how much dioxide purple is used.
You know, it's just dawned on me that the sense of the bodyliness, I think, is really apparent, but this isn't a one-to-one match, because it's not that the width of the painting as installed is actually your wingspan. It's actually the verticality of it that's your wingspan. So it's not horizontal, so we're not talking like this to the wall, we're talking this to the wall that's your wingspan.
We are talking about this as the wingspan in terms of the parameter, but this one hand up is as far as I could reach.
Okay.
And then that diamond, the other thing that there's a feature of a diamond within a box. That diamond repeats itself from 1965 through 2017. It's a return to the diamond as a vehicle for composition, but also for content.
I think you can see that on the painting that's on the far wall here. I think is it Trane Meets Jug?
Trane Meets Jug on the backside, yes.
I wonder if for you that is the sense of the truly representational coming into abstract thinking, because many painters at this moment wouldn't have admitted. Would you have told people in the 60s or even into the 70s that correlation between your physical action?
Absolutely. I don't see any problems with that. As an artist, you find a vehicle for expression, and you find vehicles that allow you for me, to forget about some. I didn't want to think about composition. I didn't want to think about color. I sometimes eliminate tools, eliminate ways of doing things so that I can go directly to the painting And once I'm inside of the painting, once I'm painting the painting, then I can begin to think about content. I can't think about it beforehand or afterwards. Content only comes during the process of making it. And when I say content, most people, I shouldn't say, some people think of content as literature. Tell me the story. What is it about? That's not how I make art, nor is that what I'm interested in. The story, the narrative, words, and or literature is not part of what I consider content. And the reason I say that is I separate the visual from the literary. Literature requires pre-knowledge. Looking at an object doesn't require pre-knowledge. It just requires an experience.
It's true. Did you tell that to students when you returned in 1979 as the pro temp director?
Did I tell them about that
did
idea?
you talk about, I wonder what in your role as a director at Skowhegan, what did you actually say to the students to let them get to their own knowledge of that kind?
The year I was the director, I didn't say anything to the students.
Ever?
Ever.
Not once.
Ever. I mean, I literally just did not talk to the students at all.
Wow.
Because I didn't think that was my role that summer. And I just tried to keep the place together, doing an art school is like trying to herd cats. The students are doing one thing, the faculty is doing another thing, and everyone's all over the place. And a lot of your energy is spent really trying to keep the forces working together, stay focused on the objective of the place. And that's pretty much what I did that summer, just tried to keep the place going. It was also a summer with an all-female faculty. The first and only time in the history of Skowhegan that occurred. So the dynamics is you have this black guy who is the director and an all-female faculty. I think it was probably one of the most productive summers. I think it was a transition for Skowhegan as a school in terms of a kind of progressive thinking that could occur in 1979. It was a fun summer and a terrific group of students, terrific group of faculty members, and it worked. And I decided I would never do it again.
For those of you that didn't hear, she asked that as the director, did Bill pick the faculty or were they already selected in 1979?
I only chose the faculty because I was a governor as well. I didn't choose it. No, I didn't decide to have an all-female faculty. I was one of 15 people that voted that particular group of artists to come. It wasn't a choice of making an all-female faculty. It was a choice of choosing 5 people that were good artists to come and work that were 5 distinctly different voices. That was the choice that was made.
At this point, though, you could just own it and say, yes, I chose them all.
No, I don't want, no. See, I have this bad habit, I won't take credit for anything I didn't do, and I won't take credit for something someone else did. So it's like, if you ask me about criticism or something someone wrote about me, it's not my business. I don't get involved in it. If I wrote it, I will talk to you about it, or if I did it. But if someone else has done it, yeah.
I didn't know about that Trane and Jug. Is there like a lineage you're drawing between Trane's adventures and this kind of tradition, articulation?
It's something that I wanted to hear.
Okay.
It's kind of wanting those two people and those two distinctly different traditions, but yet a similar tradition to come together. Because I think they both started a similar kind of, at one point, playing in rhythm and blues bands, and then they evolve into something else. Music is a huge part of my existence as an artist and as a painter.
Bill, can you just tell us who were the two musicians that you're actually referencing that are referenced in the painting?
The painting is referencing John Coltrane and Gene Ammons. Well, no, the faculty at Pratt chose the person. There was no application on my part. There was none of that. It was the faculty of the art school chose me to go. It was paid for by Skowhegan or by some patron. So I wasn't involved in that process. When I say I was told that I was going, I mean literally I was told that I was going.
Did your time at Skowhegan influence your proposal for the Studio Museum residency?
I just want to repeat. She asked if his time at Skowhegan, if it influenced his proposal for the Studio Museum Artist in Residence program, which he submitted when? 1968?
Yeah. There were a number of things that probably influenced my thinking. Certainly that experience that I had there was important. I also, when I was in graduate school, I had a job working in a community center in New Haven. And I was working with really young artists. And what struck me was they were coming all the way across town to come to this place to make art, or to learn something about art. And I kept thinking about the role and function of art in my life when I was young. How did I get to wanting to be an artist? What were the resources that were available in terms of where I grew up? And it just seems to me that the artists could have an enormous impact in a community, both as a catalyst for other young artists, but that art itself, be it music, dance, painting, whatever, sculpture or video, whatever it may be, I think artists are positive people. I think it's about, you make art because you're trying to reaffirm life. You're trying to suggest that there is a commonality of, that we all have, and that common interest is what we should be striving for. I'm going around the world, but I just thought 1968 that a museum or an artist in residence program in a community would be helpful. And in the long term, it has proven that it has been extraordinarily helpful in both the development of that community, but also in the development of a lot of artists. Up to this point, I think there are more than 120 artists that have come through the program. A lot of them are
Some of the best people I know.
From Kennedy Wiley, or is that how you pronounce his name?
Andy Wiley.
And what's the person that had the show at the Met?
Carrie James Marshall.
Carrie
Yes.
James Marshall. There are any number of alumni that are very distinguished.
We even have one here.
You have Neri Ward that came through the program. There are about there are a lot of people that come through the program. And also Skowhegan, you know, I have always been a promoter of Skowhegan with my students. I've always tried to get them to go there to spend a summer because I thought it was a very special place, and it's a place where you really make a decision whether you're going to be an artist or not, because it's competitive and it's not competitive. But you come away realizing what you have to do if you really want to do this. And every person that I've suggested go up there has come back a better artist and has come back absolutely dedicated to this profession of wanting to be a visual artist.
This year, Bill was honored by Skowhegan, as Katie mentioned, as a recipient of an award that was in fact honoring his participation in the Artist in Residence program. So this is very timely.
This is a difficult question. I think content can come from lots of things. The paintings that I was doing in the late 60s had a number of devices that I thought spoke to that. The paintings were contained. I never allowed things to kind of go off the edges. There was this sense of suppression, containment and suppression in them. Just as in these paintings, there's a sense of extraordinary control, which can be interpreted as a kind of suppressive kind of involvement. There are lots of ways of getting politics in the paintings. Sometimes I use titles to suggest something. These paintings, I think this is New Nile, and New Nile can sometimes go over the heads of a lot of people, but New Nile is a hair care product that's used very prevalent in communities of color. And I guess it's a precursor to a lot of paintings or works of art where people have used hair as a way to speak to politics. So a lot of times, a lot of these paintings, if you really kind of go back, are loaded with both symbolism, but also speak to some of those issues. You have to be very careful when you look at my work to make an assumption because it's abstraction. It's not either aware or speaking to issues outside of itself. It's very often speaking to issues. I've said from the very beginning, my work is autobiographical. It speaks to those experiences that I've had as a human being, but also more specifically as a Black human being. The work has always been about that. I grew up in the rural South. I grew up in a situation where there were no paved roads, there was no electricity, there were no running water. The first experience in visual information that I had was with quilts. Everyone made quilts. Both they were utilitarian, just to keep people warm, but there's also an aesthetic part of that. You could distinctly tell who made a quilt in the community that I grew up in. So my introduction to wanting to be an artist, or introduction to art, comes through quilts, not through paintings. Painting comes much later. That comes way into the 50s when my parents have moved from North Carolina to New York. The first introduction to painting comes on a field trip when the class goes to the Metropolitan Museum. And that's the first body of paintings that I had seen. The experiences I had prior to that, either stained glass and or quilts, were certainly more dominant in terms of my earlier experiences.
I would like to, before I ask you to join me in thanking William T. Williams, I would invite you to come up and see Texas Lady before you leave, and then also to stay on for the reception as well, where you can talk to Bill all night. No, he has a time limit. Actually, please join me in thanking. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you.